Hello class, we're going to start Unit 3. I know we did the first unit in Semester 1 and we are skipping Unit 2 because I'm really hoping that at some point we actually go back in person, and Unit 2 is a play, which will be very difficult to do over Zoom, so we're just going to jump to Unit 3, which is Traditions and Reason, the Restoration in the 18th Century. As usual, we're going to start by going over the essential questions, the first of which is how can satire change people's behavior? If you have ever read an opinion news column or watched a television show about current events, chances are you have encountered satire. Satire uses exaggeration, irony, and/or humor to make an often serious point about a public figure, event, issue, or situation. Is satire the most effective way for a critic or comic to make a point? Who are the intended audiences of satires? What kinds of reactions do satires evoke from their audiences and occasionally their subjects? Now, this is something that should relate to all of us, considering the recent events and issues with France, because sometimes satire is not taken the right way, or it grossly offends one group of people, which isn't acceptable, right? So we are going to look at what makes effective satire. The second essential question is, what is your most memorable experience? Memory is extremely personal. After all, there are no two people alive who have the exact same memories. The things we remember about our lives often depend on who we are, what we value, and the emotions we experience during an event. What makes an experience memorable? Does an experience have to be life-changing or have to be long-term importance to be memorable? Our third essential question is, what keeps women from achieving equality with men? In many parts of the world, women are regarded as second-class citizens and do not have the same access to education, healthcare, and protection under law as men. Even in lands where gender inequality is supposedly a thing of the past, many women do not receive equal pay for equal work, and many women are severely underrepresented in positions of influence. What lies at the root of gender inequality? What must change for gender inequality to become a reality? Or for gender equality to become a reality, So here we're going to be looking at multiple countries. We do have some British lit from roughly 1700s, so 18th century, that is describing the issues, but some of the issues that are described even in the 18th century and arguably before are still issues that exist today. So we're looking at how these questions transcend throughout history. Our last essential question is, why are plagues so horrifying? Few events strike fear into humans like the threat of disease. Many people take daily precautions to avoid sickness and maintain themselves in the best possible health. When an epidemic or pandemic occurs, however, avoiding sickness can mean the difference between life and death. How have plagues, both historical and contemporary, shaped the modern world? Have human attitudes toward plagues changed as a result of modern medicine? Why do plague accounts simultaneously fascinate and repel people? This is actually, it's not a funny essential question, but in one sense, it is a funny essential question because it's very relevant. We are in the middle of a pandemic still. We're approaching 1 year. We're only 2 months away from the 1 year mark of us going into lockdown. And it's really interesting how things have played out, right? And so what are some of the effects that this has had in history and now, etc.? This is something we will explore. We're going to read an excerpt of a text called A Journal of the Plague Year, which is a fascinating story from the plague that I'll wait to talk more about it. It's one of my favorite reads, though. So what are we aiming to do in this lesson? I can analyze satire, analyze satirical devices, write a satire, analyze tone, and analyze counter-arguments. So while reading our first text, these are the 5 things that we're going to aim to be able to do. Before we can get into what our first text is going to be, we're going to do the quick history of the Restoration in the 18th century, just to give you a backdrop for where we're at in terms of what's going on in the world when these texts are being written. So, the reign of Charles II. Charles II ascended to the throne in 1660 after more than a decade in exile. Under his rule, England turned its back to the grim era of Puritan rule and entered a lively period in which upper-class social and political life copied the sophistication and splendor of the French court of Louis XIV, which, if you're familiar with Louis XIV in France, he was very extravagant. You may have visited, if you've been there, the Palace of Versailles, which is pretty much completely covered in gold, right? And that's just the splendor that they lived in while people starved. His reign brought relative stability to England. The Restoration brought about the realization that English monarchs would have to share their authority with Parliament, whose influence had increased substantially. Under his reign, Great Britain faced the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London a year later in 1666. So there were two major crises that happened during this period in Charles II's reign. Political conflicts increased after Charles's death in 1685. Under James II, England was converted to Roman Catholicism. Now, England has this really crazy history of it's Catholic one second, it's Protestant the next, and back and forth, and whoever the ruler is at the time, they dictate what the religion is, and people are beheaded and all of these horrible things just over what religion you are, right? James II was eventually forced to abdicate in 1688. So just 3 years later, he's forced to leave. And in 1689, London passed the English Bill of Rights, which does give the people a little more liberty. Just like, for example, in America, we have our Bill of Rights, and we are given certain rights that nobody can take away from us. In a country where you have a monarch, you don't necessarily have those rights. Whatever the king or queen says, that's what it is, or it's off with your head, for like Alice in Wonderland. Now, this period is known as the Age of Reason, also known as the Enlightenment. It's the period from the late 1600s to the 1700s, and it's called this because it was during this time people increasingly made use of scientific thought to understand the world. It was during this period that Sir Isaac Newton formulated the laws of gravity and motion and developed the scientific method. So you have this period to blame for half of what you learn in science. During the 1700s, it became common for male writers, artists, politicians, and others to gather in public places and exchange ideas, conduct business, and share gossip. They would literally gather in somebody's sitting room, like kind of like how the Emirati culture is today, right? Except, well, and I don't know what men talk about in those, but these people would gather in these large rooms for gathering people, and they would share like, oh, this person did this, or this person did this, or did you hear, the king is passing this law, whatever, right? But women were not welcome in these places, not to the extent that men were, obviously. So educated women had private gatherings for the same purpose. So let me put it this way. If a group of men could gather at Caribou or Starbucks, right, or in the desert, and the women would gather inside the home, for example. More women during this period began writing and publishing their work. However, I'm going to put a big asterisk here because a lot of the female writers from this period did not publish using their own name. Why might they choose to not publish using their own name? Well, if you're a woman, you are not viewed as a first-class citizen, so to speak, and people might not buy your work or take what you're saying seriously just because you're a woman, even though you might know more than men. What's going on? So women would publish over a pseudonym, or under a pseudonym, most of the time a male's name. And we see this a lot. An era of change. The spirit of the Enlightenment brought about many improvements in living conditions. For example, the practice of inoculation against disease was introduced at this time. So, that's a big step. The fact that we're going to start, vaccinating and taking measures and washing hands, because before that, people weren't really doing those things. The middle class grew and prospered, and ordinary men and women had more money, leisure time, and education than ever before. We mentioned when we studied Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales that people weren't really educated unless they had money. Now we're starting to educate even our poor. We start getting schools where anybody can go, and it's not super expensive. That you don't have to have the private tutor in your house to get a good or to get an adequate education. Good might be still a little far-fetched. For writers, this meant a broad new audience, eager to read and willing to pay for literature. Because remember, books are a luxury. So before, books are only for the wealthy. Now they're for anybody. And so when we talk about audience, like who is the audience of this text, you'll see a shift in literature from, okay, we're looking at only the rich who can read to now anybody can read. So think about some of the political movements that can come from this when people are able to read and comprehend and have discussions, right? News spreads much faster. The middle class wanted writing that reflected their own concerns and experiences. Thus, prose journalism experienced a rise in popularity. We have this whole, I almost want to say a new genre of literature, right? Of people that would go into the world, observe what was happening, and what comes to mind in particular are the factory workers. People would go observe what was happening in the mills and then write about it. And then the people that originally wouldn't have had access to information, or working class population, could now go read and mobilize, which is, it's a great improvement, right? That's part of the reason why the UAE focuses so much on education and literacy, is because people, if you take away the ability to read and write from a generation, you break them at the knees, essentially. Your education is a lot for who you are. So this is a great thing. Vocabulary words. These are the 5 words I need you guys to write down and define in your notebook. You'll find the definitions for these in the beginning of Unit 3 in your textbook. You can also use a dictionary if that's easier for you, but you need to know what these words are by the time we start reading. All right, have a good day.